Welcome, everybody. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to this event. So looking forward to it. So the webinar today is titled To Know the World, Social and Environmental Learning in the Anthropocene with Mitch Thomashow. And the event is hosted by FieldNotes, which is a series of conversations offered by Fielding's Office of the President, and also sponsored by the Sustainability Advisory Council. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you, Mitch Thomashow, to this event. Mitch lives in New England. He's the author of a number of books, including Ecological Identity, Bringing the Biosphere Home, and his most recent publication, which is the topic of our event today, To Know the World, A New Vision for Environmental Learning. Mitch's work focuses on promoting ecological awareness and citizenship, sustainable living, and creative learning in a systemic framework of environmental education, a perfect fit for some of Fielding's work and values. And Mitch has been a university president at Unity College and department chair, program director, and faculty at Antioch, New England's environmental studies program. And more personally, Mitch was one of my faculty when I was a student at Antioch, New England about 25 years ago. And the class I took with him on ecological identity had a huge impact on how I approach my work. And so it's really such a pleasure to welcome you to this event, Mitch, and to spend this time with you. So I'm going to turn this over now to Fred Steyer, who is going to take us into the event.
Yeah, thanks so much, Abigail, and welcome everyone. This is such a pleasure to be hosting or co-hosting this event or co-facilitating. I'm not sure exactly what Abigail and I are calling ourselves. One of the challenges of this event is to have some balance of what we might be doing in terms of our own process fitting with the content that Mitch is going to be speaking about. So on the one hand, we're really trying to build social, or it might be ecological capital around this. So to not just to listen to Mitch's ideas, which are wonderful, but to also have this as a forum for connecting with each other. So how to balance that out, we weren't sure, but we thought that because the group that we have on this Zoom meeting is so international. We have people from Shanghai, we have people from Stockholm, from Larvik, Norway, from all over North America. So we thought you could introduce yourselves in the chat, just your name and something very brief about where you are. Sometimes when you do that, you also put in a weather report. I guess that's okay. But use that as a way of just seeing who else is here and connecting with each other. During the course of the session, what we would really like you to do is to also honor one of the key issues about environmental learning, which is listening, and to pay close attention to what Mitch is saying, and to think about issues of the sound environment for ourselves. So although the chat is open, instead of using the chat like we might in some circumstances where we pass notes to each other behind the teacher's back, there's no teacher in this case. If you do have a question, and it's a serious question, maybe raise your hand or you can post it, but try to be mindful of the entire surround of what's going on here, and use the chat sparingly. But for now, by all means, post yourself where you are and quick greetings to each other. And yeah, the way that we'll be moving forward in this is Mitch will be speaking for a while, maybe 45 minutes or so, and there's a very powerful slide deck that we'll be making use of. And then we'll open to questions. And rather than having breakout groups, we thought to have this as one intact group, so we also get to know each other a little bit better. Yeah, Mitch.
Okay, thank you.
And thanks so much for doing this, Mitch. I'm really looking forward to it myself.
I'm really so happy to be with you and have the opportunity. Let me just do some screen maintenance, because I'm distracted by all the people who are here and where they're from, and it's just great to see. Golden, British Columbia, Norway, Santa Barbara, where the weather is sunny as usual. Berkeley, Columbus, New York City, go Knicks. Toronto, Rabat, Morocco, the marshy coast of Georgia, San Francisco, Seattle, where I'll be next week, Mozambique, living in Uruguay, Northern California, Edinburgh. How amazing, really. I'm still in a state of awe that we can all gather this way. So let me get launched here. I'll try to ground you with where I am. I'm in the hills of South. It's hot today, it's 86 degrees. We went right from early spring to summer, and the biomass proliferation is absolutely extraordinary. One day it seemed like the forest was bare, and shortly thereafter it's fully leafed out. I'm always amazed at how quickly spring comes in New Hampshire, compared to the Pacific coast where it really takes a while. But we're expecting a vigorous cold front later, and the temperature is going to go down to the low 40s tonight. So we're going to see a huge drop. The weather changes so frequently here. We've got lots of migrating warblers and birds in general. Dragonflies are back. At night, you hear the frogs. It's a really great place to live. I've been here since 1977. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you an overview of this book, To Know the World, A New Vision for Environmental Learning. The book came out in October. I'm very excited about it. I want to share it as much as I possibly can. I want to say a little bit about why I wrote the book. But first, I want to take you through my previous work, so you have a context in that regard. These are 3 of 4 previous books that I've written. The first one, Ecological Identity, came out in 1995, and it reflected my work in Antioch, New England, to which Abigail referred. I was fascinated by all the people who were coming into our programs and why they chose the environmental field. You know, what was it about human nature relationships that so inspired them to dedicate their lives to it? So I wrote a book about that, essentially, and I was interested in seeing how, when people enter the field, how does it change their view of education, their view of spirituality, and of course their views about the natural world. And it occurred to me, it was clear that it was a function of identity. So I called the book Ecological Identity, and discussed a lot of the challenges that people in the field face, and some of the pedagogy that can address those challenges. And then the next book I wrote came out in 2001. I think it's still absolutely pertinent today if anyone cares to check it out. It's about global environmental change. I attended a conference on biodiversity in Washington, and my utter naivety about the state of the world hit me hard. I learned all about the 6th mega extinction, and I was really interested in why it's so hard for people to perceive these global environmental changes. So I wrote a book about it. And the basic idea of the book is that intimate awareness of local natural history enables you to broaden your spatial and temporal perception. And that's what's crucial for understanding global environmental change. And just as crucial today as it was, 20 years ago. And I also looked at some of the existential dilemmas and challenges that are intrinsic to contemplating these questions. Then the 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus came out in 2013, and it reflected a lot of my experience with university presidents and administrators and students and faculty about how to make your campus more sustainable. It's comprehensive, it's ecological, it's bioregional, that's administratively savvy, that implies shared governance. And that's what that book is about. And it's been used quite a bit. I still get some calls around it. So this new book, To Know the World, really is part of that first Ecological Identity, Bring the Biosphere Home trilogy. It in many respects, it takes up where Bring the Biosphere Home left off. So I'm going to go through this whole book. I'm not going to go over every chapter in detail. That's obviously impossible. I really hope that you pick up the book and read it. I think it's got a lot of, I think it's accessible and warm and personal and pertinent to the kinds of issues that we're all thinking about every day. I'm going to focus specifically on chapters 5 and 6, constructive connectivity and migration, but I'm going to cover everything here because I want you to see the whole picture of what this book is about. The reason why I wrote the book is because after all these years in the environmental field, gosh, it's almost 45 years at least. I'm concerned that the field has become staid and maybe even somewhat stale. Over the last decade, there's been a tremendous emphasis on sustainability. But I think that once environmental studies, when I grew up and went to college, there was no place there was no field of environmental studies in the late 60s or early 70s. So my generation, many colleagues and peers and now close friends built this field. We wanted to create the programs that we always would have liked to have participated in. But once a field becomes established, it often becomes a little bit conservative in terms of whether it's willing to change curriculum. And I think we're at a stage now, both in terms of higher education and certainly in terms of the state of the planet, where we have no choice but to be radical and bold and creative in terms of how we think about not only pedagogy, but also the content and substance of what we teach. So I hope this book, part of the reason why I wrote it is my attempt to say what environmental learning ought to be. But I wrote it in such a way that it's much more important for me that you think about that, and that this is just one approach that we could take. And the whole idea of the book is to prompt your own resourcefulness and your own action. Whatever your field might be, fielding is filled with folks who do psychology and organizational management, but you're always close to the action when it comes to environment. Just like if you do environment, you're always close to the action when it comes to politics and psychology and education. So that's part of why I wrote this book. I was very influenced way back in the 1960s by the Whole Earth Catalog. I used to, when I was a student at NYU, which was in the Bronx at the time, I used to take the subway downtown every Friday because we'd usually go see some of the rock concerts at the Cafe A Go-Go. All the British bands were coming for the first time and the West Coast bands. But before I went to see those concerts, I would go to the 8th Street bookstore. Of course, there was no internet then. And I was so interested in all the action, all the new movements that were taking place. The 60s was the time of convergence for the women's movement, the peace movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement. It was an amazing and exciting time. And so one day I saw this book, The Whole Earth Catalog, and to use the language of the times, I said something like wow, and I pulled the book off the shelf and immersed myself in it really for weeks and even years to come. And in retrospect, I think a lot of what the environmental field and the sustainability field have done is try to recreate many of the ideas that were embedded in this Whole Earth Catalog. Whenever I give any talk anywhere about anything, I always try to remind people that this is an exquisitely beautiful planet that we live on. And I think this riveting image, which I hope never becomes trite, should always serve to remind us of that, both its beauty and its fragility. I always say jokingly that it reminds me of a lovely marble that I had as a child. But this is a pearl, it's a jewel, it's a marble in our hands. And we need to never forget that this is why we do all this work, that learning to perceive global environmental change is the crucial educational challenge of our times. And I like to briefly review the structure of that challenge. We are in the early days of the 6th mega extinction. There have been 5 previous mega extinctions during the history of life on Earth. A mega extinction is a period of time, speaking geologically, when over 60% of the Earth's species perish. We are deeply involved right now in the 6th mega extinction. The difference between this one and previous ones is that this is anthropogenic, that is, it's human caused. Others were caused by shifting climatic plates, shifting biogeochemical cycles, asteroid strikes, etc. It's amazing. It's a remarkable aspect of humanity, actually, that we've been able to figure out at least some of these things. And of course, the 6th mega extinction is accompanied by plunging declines in biodiversity and what I like to describe as rapidly changing atmospheric and oceanic circulations, which I think is a more complete way of talking about climate change. In fact, The oceans and the atmosphere are an amazing circulatory system that's being tampered with in ways that we don't completely understand. There's so many variables, and with this come biogeochemical imbalances, like too much carbon in the atmosphere, and many others. But this, look, you could spend an entire lifetime studying environmental change, and it's fascinating to do so. And I think anyone who's concerned about these issues at least needs a cursory understanding of these challenges. But I do want to remind us that this is why we do it. This is why I write a book. This is why we do sustainability. This is the point of it all. However, what's happening now is that environmental concerns are connected to many other pertinent issues: economic opportunity, social justice, healthcare, racism, violent conflict, global poverty. But the connections between these issues and the ecological fate of the planet are not easily perceived. So the challenge is, what is the role of environmental studies, or for that matter, any field of study that you're engaged in making those connections more clear? But that's part of the challenge as well, not only for people in the field of environment, but also for the people in the fields that you all are participating in and gaining expertise in. We are living at a time when the same issues of the 60s are converging on us again, but in an even more intense way. And I want to go over what those changes are and why they're so crucial, and why it's so necessary for us to connect them all. So I call these 4 conditions that represent the tides of change. The tides of change is a chapter in the book, and I go into these in much, much more detail. So condition 1, which I just explained, is the rapacious exploitation of the biosphere and its life systems. Our challenge for educators and citizens alike is, how do we best communicate the necessity of ecosystem thinking? Condition 2 is the increasing disparity between rich and poor. How do we promote economic equity and social justice in cultures of materialism and entitlement? Condition 3 is the apprehension concerning the integration and separation of global cultures. How do we promote intercultural understanding and cosmopolitan thinking in the midst of nationalist responses and ethnic chauvinism? And finally, condition 4 is violence, weapons, and terror compete with deliberation, diplomacy, and collaboration. How do we settle our differences through community democracy, compromise, and service in the midst of conflict, extreme behavior, and fear? These are, I think, more complete ways of describing what's often referred to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Condition 2 is equity. Condition 3 is diversity, and condition 4 is inclusion. Now, the issue is this. For many, many years, people in the environmental field, and there were many who thought, well, we just need to educate about condition 1. Let other people take care of the rest. It's not really our concern. And for many years, people who were concerned about conditions 2, 3, and 4 just assumed that they could really focus on those things and didn't need to be necessarily as concerned about environmental issues. Of course, this is a broad stereotype that I'm presenting. But the fact of the matter is, all of these are connected. You can't look at any of these phenomena or challenges or questions without looking at the other ones as well. And most people, I would say this, another broad generalization, just about anybody under 30 who's involved in environmental work and social justice work gets this. They understand the dynamic interrelationship between all of these questions. So it's time that all of our fields, in terms of our teaching and our learning and our action and activism and our community service, think this way as well. So I look at this at great depth in this particular chapter. There are very important trends that impact the future of environmental learning. We live on an urban planet. By 2050, 80% of the global population, which apparently is shrinking now, will be living in cities. There's no turning back the necessity and the importance and the demographic urgency of cosmopolitan culture. And a lot of what we saw during the last shameful administration was the attempt to turn the clock back on this. And obviously, this is still a very tender and challenging concern for all of us. But we know that, I'll get into this in more detail later, so that's enough on that for now. The issue of ecological equity and social justice, of course, is front and center, to use actually the title of a very important activist organization in Seattle. Another interesting challenge is that the spread, dissemination, intricacy, and complexity of information networks breeds new cognitive orientations that change the way we perceive nature. I'll say more about that in a moment. And here's another issue that's on everyone's mind. Look, any of these topics we could spend an entire, afternoon discussing. And that is, I think increasingly we're trying to understand the relationship between openness and vigilance. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, we have to keep an open mind to multiple points of view. But on the other hand, because of the way the world is right now, we also have to be vigilant about people who really want to shut down opposite points of view, and be careful in that regard. So this is a very interesting question that we need to discuss at some length, is how you remain open and stay vigilant at the same time. The fourth chapter in the book I describe is called, Is the Anthropocene Blowing Your Mind? And the reason why I describe it that way is because I want to suggest that this idea of the Anthropocene, which I'll say more about in a moment, is not only an ecological challenge, but also a psychological one. By the way, some of the artwork here is done by my son, who is a mural artist in Hobart, Tasmania. And if you're interested in seeing more of his work, you can check out his website. But he does what I would call shamanic visionary environmental. This is forever, because he's in Tasmania, and Lord knows when that country will be opened up again. But he was here some years ago, and he painted this in Cambridge to depict rising seas along the Atlantic coast. I start this chapter in a way that's very personal. I want to tell you about what I've done, because I think it's relevant to all of our lives. On the upper left-hand corner is my desktop, and we all know what prominent role our desktops play in our lives, to the point that they're really embedded in our consciousness in ways that I sometimes are helpful, but often very distracting, I think. And as I'm looking at this, I'm realizing that I spend a tremendous amount of time on the internet for a variety of different types of reasons. And when you're on the internet, or if you're on your phone and looking at that small screen, your world is just really shrunk into a very small window, but it feels like you have access to a big, big world. Whereas in fact, you're looking at it through this tiny little window on your screen. So I shift from that and look at, this is my room where I'm currently speaking to you from, and I look at all the curated bookshelves and realize that every one of these bookshelves is a portal also. That any one of these books is an entry into another world. I wouldn't call it a virtual world, but it's not a direct experience so much. And then I look out the window, and finally I go outside, and everything completely changes. My senses are alive. I see I'm part of the biosphere again. I'm out of my head and into the world. It's an important way of knowing the world. And it's a way of knowing the world that is just dissipating. And that's part of what it means to live in the Anthropocene. So what I do in this chapter is I explain these dynamics, and I try to provide some solutions, some ways of moving out of it. And I do this not from the perspective of a Luddite. I was very influenced by Gary Snyder's amazing line in his Four Changes poem that runs on the bottom of the Whole Earth catalog way back in 1969, where he has a vision of computer programmers who walk with the elk. And in fact, that's a very interesting vision. So the Anthropocene then is two mutually conducive trends. On the one hand, it's the global extraction of natural resources, which has gone on unabated, really since the spread of European imperialism west, and the rise of rapid industrialization, first in Europe and then around the world. But the other is the intensity of electronic connectivity, which again, I'll say a lot more about later. These things work together. You can't have this intensity of electronic connectivity without the global extraction of natural resources, and vice versa. There's a fantastic new book, by the way, I highly recommend, called Atlas of AI, in which Kate Crawford, published by Yale University Press, in which Kate goes through exactly how and why the intensity of electronic connectivity and artificial intelligence is a process of global extraction of natural resources. And she gets into a lot of the politics in that regard. And a good book to read with it is Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, which looks at some of the racial challenges that that result from this very same dynamic. I think it's a very important area of study, for sure. Very relevant, I think, for the media psychology program at Fielding, by the way. So what we have is a dynamic perceptual reconditioning of human perceptual awareness. And the challenge for us as citizens and as educators and as parents and as community members, as sons and daughters, is how do we reclaim autonomy in a time of global transformation? So I look a lot at this issue of autonomy in this chapter, because it's hard to reclaim autonomy when you're constantly being besieged, whether you're online or whether you answer whether there's a scammer on your phone or whether you're looking at an advertisement, whatever it might be. There's so many demands on your attention all the time. How do we reclaim autonomy in that regard? And I think that's part of the psychological and conceptual challenge of what it means to live in these times in the Anthropocene. And it's especially important for kids now to understand how they can empower themselves to reclaim autonomy. If we do this, it could be a time of human awakening. There are some real positive things that can come out of these possibilities that are at. Another piece of work by Jake, I love this because to me, it represents human self-awareness reflecting back on itself on this detritus of an oil tank on a beach, on a pristine beach in Tasmania. So what I suggest in this chapter is that we emphasize the deliberate pause. And what I mean by that is we find moments in the day when we can disassociate from electronic connectivity and just be part of the biosphere. Mindful environmental awareness activities, if you will. Sometimes it's all you need is 60 seconds. When you step outside and go between buildings, if you're looking at the screen, you know, we're all supposed to take breaks every 20 or 30 minutes just to move our bodies because we're not meant to sit this long. Well, you can also focus on the natural environment at the same time. So I have all kinds of suggestions in the chapter. In all the chapters, the book is filled with suggestions, free advice, if you will. I want to spend a little bit more time on the next two chapters, and then I'll go through the last three a little bit more rapidly. This is a photo. Think for a moment if you have any idea what this is, and I'll tell you, of course. This is the golden spike in Promontory, Utah, in the desert, maybe an hour and a half northwest of Salt Lake City. And I'm fascinated by the final connectivity of the Transcontinental Railroad, because that meant that goods could move from east to west very quickly. The Transcontinental Railroad, by the way, is in and of itself a fascinating capitalist process, which was filled with fraud, people borrowing money that they didn't have, the uprooted indigenous tribes that had to leave their land to make way for the railroad, and the immigrant forced labor that was used to build it. It is really quite a story. But what I want to focus on right now, I want to give you that footnote about it because politics is part of everything. But I also want to suggest that this laid the way conceptually for the internet. Once we have goods going back and forth. By the way, if you're interested in the connectivity of transportation, there's a recent article in the London Review of Books by John Lanchester, who's a great novelist, by the way, on the great container ships and what happened when the Suez Canal got clogged up. But he winds up getting into the global supply chain in a way that is absolutely brilliant. It is a great essay. You can, if you don't subscribe to the journal, you can just go online and probably get an article or, article or two for free to read for free. Highly recommend this incredible essay just for the sheer brilliance of its writing. I don't remember the name, but it's John Lanchester who's talking about container ships. He's reviewing a book about the history of the Suez Canal, which, who cares? I mean, on some level, then you start reading the review and you realize, wow, it's amazing how everything is in fact connected, constructive connectivity. So I want to talk a little bit about ecological networks and social networks before I digress too quickly. I want to get back to the main theme here, and that is what I'm trying to do in this chapter is show that there's a direct relationship between ecological and social networks, and that ecological networks provide us with a template for how to think about our relationship to the biosphere. They're also structures of extraordinary beauty. On the bottom left is a photo from the air of dendritic drainage, which is the geomorphological term. On the upper right, you see tree roots. On the bottom right, you see mycelium, which it turns out are the great connectors of our forests. When I look outside my window right now at the forest in New Hampshire, underneath the ground is this sophisticated network of mycelium that send messages back and forth between different species. Paul Stamets, the great mushroom visionary, describes mycelium as the original internet. There's so much to read about this. And by the way, if anyone's interested in any of the resources that I cite and want to get more information from me, by all means, send me an email. Contact information will be provided later on, and I'm happy to chat with you or to provide you with the resources that I mentioned. So there's so much to be learned about in terms of how we understand the fabric of the biosphere by studying these networks. Yet, if you think about the number of mycelial researchers or soil scientists, for that matter, and compare that to the number of lawyers, economists, and bankers, it's absurd. You can't even scale it. So there are so few people studying this stuff, and arguably they are some of the most important phenomena that we need to better understand to represent our place on the planet and who we are and how we can thrive here. And everything is migrating and moving and connecting all the time. There's a wonderful book on global bird migration that just came out by Scott Wiedensall that discusses just the extraordinary movement of shorebirds around the Pacific and of course around the world. There's a stylized network on the left of ecological relationships in a habitat. And this is a very interesting new dynamic field in ecological research. The idea that by understanding the interactive networks in an ecosystem, we have a much better sense of what's happening. It's not just prey-predator relationships. It's not just the food chain and all these cycles. It's also this network connectivity that takes place in space and in time that we barely understand. Look at the diagram on the right, on my right anyway, which is the circle with all the connections, because I'm going to show you a couple of more diagrams that look almost exactly the same, but are covering completely different subjects. The one on the left, also that circle enfolded within it, these show networks within a system. And these are ecological networks demonstrating a food web, in fact. But keep that in your mind, because we're going to get back to this template and what it represents. So I spend a lot of time looking at both ecological networks and then social networks, because the challenge of social networks is you have young kids now who are looking at iPads or phones or whatever, and they immediately are engaged in social networks, but it's very rare that there's any instruction whatsoever in how to use them and how to thrive in them and how to fend off predators in them. All of these are really important things to teach. Yet you'd be hard pressed to find any college or any university in North America that requires freshmen to study networks, or for that matter, any elementary school or any high school. I can't think of anything more important for understanding how to flourish and also understanding what some of the dangers are of immersing yourself in social networks. This is really crucial material. Field or any graduate school that offers graduate programming in better understanding the stuff, I think would be doing a great thing. It turns out that most of us wind up in homological networks, which is networks of similarity. We wind up hanging with similar types of people. But the truly creative people are the ones who are nodes in homological networks. That is, you are connecting two different homological networks. It's like the kid in high school who really wasn't a jock or really wasn't one of the super smart, who was able to hang out with lots of different groups, but never really feeling intrinsically part of one. All of these things need to be taught, I believe, so you understand where you are. So one of the things I've done, and I focus on this a lot in the book, is I provide activities and experiences for people to better understand their relationship in networks. And I've done this in organizational settings. I work with Harvard University's Sustainability Office, which consists of 20 staff, and ask people to construct their networks so they could better understand as an organization what their reach was. In some cases, they surprised themselves, and also what their blind spots were. And by the way, in most of these elite institutions, the blind spots typically are their linkages with communities of color. So one of the things that you can do with diagrams of this kind and these kinds of organizational challenges is begin to see how your network itself, which you may think is sprawling, is really quite homological in its own right. And then the challenge becomes, well, where do you want to be? You know, where are the places where you want to be? Where are the places you want to learn from that you're not currently learning from? There's a lot that can be done with all of this. Just for fun, and I often do this when I do slideshows, I put social networks in Google Images. Google Images is a great resource. And this is what comes up. So these are a whole bunch of, these are LinkedIn diagrams showing LinkedIn networks. It's really interesting. There are all kinds of fantastic books about this. Here's one. It's good that I'm doing this right here in my study and I can reach some of these books. Here's a phenomenal book called Visual Complexity by Manuel Lima that's filled with amazing diagrams and explanations of networks and how we learn just from the structural configuration of networks. There's something to be learned just in that. So anyway, I think this is a great frontier, especially for the organizational management people at Fielding, the psychology people, and absolutely for the environmental studies people. Now I want to switch to something that's very connected to networks, because networks are about movement, and this is migration. Migration, and the chapter is called Migration, the Arrival and Departure of Species, and I try to show the relationship between human migration and species migration, and also migration as a phenomenon of the biosphere itself. Migration is the most pertinent question that we will all face in the next several decades and that we currently face now. All of this wall crap, honestly, is a demagogic approach to sweeping this challenge someplace else. But the fact of the matter is, it's with us. And there has to be some way for us to figure out how people can move more freely from one place to another. And it's not just folks who are forced to leave their home place, many of whom, by the way, are people like ourselves. If you look at what's happened in Syria, for example, there are countless middle-class people. It's usually dispossessed people or people from poor communities that are the ones who are most affected by all of this, but it could be anyone at any time. So this is a huge challenge for us to think about, and I've devoted a chapter to it. First point I want to make is that humans have always been on the move. And if you look at this map of world migration since 1500, I mean, look at the spread, especially from Europe to North America. And then folks in North America, after they colonized it and uprooted most of the indigenous populations, have the audacity to keep other people out. But you can see that these movements take place absolutely everywhere. And lots of study and a lot to learn. It's a fascinating aspect of our own legacy. And if you go back even further, you realize that humans left Africa not that long ago, and it didn't take them very long at all to settle the entire globe. We're still learning about all of this, but the fact is, humans have always been on the move. And you can make an argument that being on the move is intrinsic to what it means to be human. So the idea that we can somehow stop this with walls or boundaries or borders is facile. That's not to say there needs to be complete openness between borders, but we have to think very creatively and carefully about how we manage these movements, because in fact, one of the things that we know is that migration is going to increase in years to come. And if you think about migration, not only in terms of that is the country to climate or ecological disaster or political oppression, there are lots of people within countries that are forced, called internal displacements, that are forced to leave. Think about what's happened in the States over the last decade or so, between the hurricanes and between the fires, the numbers of people who have to give up what they have and go someplace else. So this is a huge challenge for anyone who is concerned about our country and the world. Here's an interesting map that shows you all the places where there are walls that are separate various places. And here are a few pictures of some of those walls. The one on the upper left separates the United States from Arizona. Arizona from Mexico. The one on the upper right keeps people out of Hungary. The Great Wall of China is a very interesting story in its own right. And on the right, bottom right, you see a wall that separates Kuwait and Iraq. This, I find these images shattering and deeply disturbing, and I hope you do as well. There's got to be a better way of thinking about this. The dark humor here is, in fact, that the wall doesn't work. People will always find a way to move through. Certainly, many species will. That's not to say that these walls sometimes block the habitat movements that are so necessary, especially in terms of climate change. But the fact of the matter is, typically, people find ways around these gross structures. So as I said before, there are external displacements and internal displacements. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but internal displacements affect SDGs or Sustainability Development Goals, and they impact internal displacement and vice versa. So these are important questions. And as I say to anyone who will listen, if you're interested in program development in higher education or in communities, the place where human health and migration and climate change all converge because these are the really challenging questions in everyone's mind. And there are, if you think about it, and you know this already, I'm just reiterating what most of you already know, and that is that we have been so massively distracted from the essence of this problem. And the distractions are, I won't get into them because I don't want to go down that path. They're self-evident. But we need to recall everyone's attention so that we can really see the relationship between issues of public health and issues of migration and issues of climate, because this is what our future is all about, is understanding how to work with them. Here's another one of those diagrams, similar to the ecological network diagram. There'll be one more coming up shortly. And this is just a sort of a flash statement of where people were moving in the mid-2000s, between mid-2005 and mid-2010. Look at that chart of the incredible movement of people between countries. And as much as Americans would like to think that they're the only country in the world that has to deal with immigrants coming from the South, no, that's not true. Immigrants are moving between countries everywhere on this planet all of the time. If you want to, for a really silly exercise, when you travel again, the next time you travel, and if you travel by plane, and if you check your luggage, when you go to the luggage carousel, think about all the pieces of luggage on that particular carousel, and then think about all the carousels in that airport, and then think about all the carousels in all the airports on the planet, and tell me that we're not a migratory species. So the reason why we're a migratory species is because everything on this planet migrates, metaphorically. The continents do, because ancient Gondwana, 250 million years ago, which was first beginning to separate from the ancient Gondwana landmass, has eventually become what you see now on the bottom right. So everything moves. So in order to survive when everything moves, you have to move as well. So species migrate in order to accommodate these changes. They are migrating right now. And this is a map, which is supposed to be a map in motion. So you can use your imagination or get out those 3D glasses you've got in your pocket, and you can watch this lively movement of things from south to north currently taking place in North America. It's beautiful. I think migration itself is it's a miracle, really. Think of it, the birds, they're now thinking, we know so little about bird migration. We thought we knew a lot, but we don't know anything. And it's turning out right now that some of the latest research suggests, again, this is a brief digression, that it's not just that the birds understand migration or where to go based on the magnetic poles, but there may be something at the quantum level that birds are reading in order to move from one place to another. It's absolutely fascinating what's happening in the world of bird migration. So on the left, you see a stylized map of what will happen projected into the future with the movement of plants. Plants move as well. Think about the ice sheet covering most of North America. And as the ice sheet retreats, everything starts moving back north again. So it moves through seeds. The plants move because they have seeds, and then mammals and birds are seed carriers. And they move everything with, it's all part of the same system. And that's the monarch on the right, which is a very interesting story in its own right. Whale migration. You can go on and on and on. Dragonflies, bats. If you want to read more about this, and I feel you should, here's some great books. The Next Great Migration is by Sonia Shaw. I highly recommend it. It's a great overview of both ecological, social, and political migration. She really understands a lot. It's a very harsh critique, by the way, of ecological theory and population theory, which she feels has often been racist. It's a very compelling argument. I highly recommend it. Isabel Wilkerson, whose recent book Caste is also a brilliant book, wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, which is the epic story of America's great migration, African-American migration from south to north. And then National Geographic had a recent issue, well, not that recent now, maybe 2 years old, A World on the Move. And there are all these UN agencies that were filled with reports and things that you can look at and read about if you want to learn more about this issue. Okay, so where are we on time? How long have I gone on for?
Probably for about 35 minutes, 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good. That's perfect. I don't want to go for too much longer than 10 because that's probably enough for everybody. Certainly for me. I want to just say a few words. I'm not going to get into this in too much depth, but I want to say a few words on behalf of the beauty of cosmopolitan culture and how enriching it is when you live in a diverse world, and how much, and by diversity, I'm referring to all aspects of it. Obviously, people from different ethnic communities, people from different generations, people of different sexual preferences. This is how we learn. This is so crucial to education, and we constantly we know this, and we have to always keep it really on the tip of our tongues in terms of our practice and our ideas. And if you look at the so-called Anthropocene heroes, people around the world who are doing remarkable environmental grassroots work, it's everybody. It's communities of color all over the world who are making these things happen. People you've never heard of, and I've never heard of, are these true pioneers and heroes of the times that we live in. And the world has always been cosmopolitan. Here is a map of the various language groups in pre-European North America. This is a cosmopolitan North America. We know that there was a lot of trade that was going on. And I don't want to paint a rosy picture of everyone getting along. Of course, there was conflict. Of course, there were battles. And there were tribes that weren't particularly sustainable, but most were. But you can see here how, and these different groups, by the way, language groups, correspond to physiographic features as well. So I love looking at this map as a reminder of what North America was once like and how diverse it was, just based on the indigenous populations. And here's another map. It's a current map of different dialects in North America, the different ways that people speak English. So sometimes when we think about the homogeneity of everything, you know, just beyond the surface, under the surface of all that, there's vast difference in, as I mentioned before, in ethnicity, in generation, in sexual preference, and also in the way we speak language. Just the English language alone, not to mention all the other languages. I'm still very moved by the notion of place and the notion of bioregionalism. I'll say a little bit more about place at the very end of this slideshow, but this is a lovely visualization of what a bioregional North America would look like. And think about what it would be if we were many nations in one. How did this ever become one country? But it would be like if there were all these different principalities. The idea of bioregionalism is that political boundaries are less a matter of land ownership and colonialism and more a matter of physiography, ecology, and geography. And it's a beautiful notion, originating in the 60s and 70s and still vital today. Okay. I want to say a word also for ecological urbanism, because the fact is that there's a tremendous amount going on in cities all over the world. I love Hunterwasser's art, and there are so many ways that cities are and can be beautiful. There's a fantastic book, but it's out of my reach right now, called Ecological Urbanism, which is a phenomenal anthology. You can go to most cities around the world and throw a rock and find a project of some kind or another that's making a difference, that understands the necessity of all the things that we've been talking about today. Okay, so now I'm going to spend a little bit less time on these, but I just want to give you a book. There's a whole chapter on improvisation. Improvisation has been so crucial in my own life, both as a musician, as a basketball player, as someone who observes nature, and as a former university president, where I'd have to improvise all the time because every day something would happen that I never quite believed could. And that's true in life in general. So I spend a whole chapter talking about improvisational learning and why that's crucial for a type of excellence that allows for adaptation. These are some works that I find very helpful. Again, you can read more about it in the book. I'm not going to go over them in so much detail now, but think about when you best learn and how much learning takes place when you have to think on your feet. You have to think quickly. But when you do think quickly, there's usually a structure that you can rely on, and then you can adapt that structure. So in jazz, for example, there are going to be certain foundational chords or chord progressions or techniques that you have, and then you're off on your own. In basketball, there are certain fundamentals, and then you're off on your own. In dance, in any field whatsoever. And that's true, I think, in the environmental world as well. Sometimes I look at the biosphere and I see the epitome, the template for improvisational excellence, a cloud formation there's a certain structure to clouds, but it's always going to be different. It's always changing. Every day is different. I also want to do a shout out, if you will, to the remarkable and wonderful book of wisdom, the I Ching, which in effect is a biospheric system of knowledge based on biosphere archetypes and icons and their interrelationship together. And I have a whole section in the book where I fantasize or suggest that somebody somewhere comes up with an environmental change I Ching, where you're able to look at all these different dynamics and better understand the natural world by looking at these dynamics. Someone had the audacity and courage and creativity to do a psychedelic I Ching. You can spend a lot of time checking this one out at some point. You can just find it on the internet, look up psychedelic I Ching. I can't say I understand any of it, but it looks really cool. There's a chapter called Perceptual Reciprocity, and what by that I mean, this gets more into, I guess, the origins of my interest in environmental learning, how we learn to perceive the biosphere in more deep ways. And my view is that everything on this planet perceives. That doesn't mean everything is sentient, although many things may be sentient. But what I mean by that is I think all species, all critters perceive, and I think landscapes actually perceive. Although what we mean by perception is a whole nother conversation. So how do we enhance perceptual reciprocity is really the final question I ask in this book. How do we awaken ourselves to how much we can learn when we begin to perhaps see the world through the eyes of others, both in terms of different types of people and different types of species and different types of landscapes? Okay, so here's the last diagram in this sequence that stretches back through the whole show. This is from, there's a guy named Robin Carhart who wrote an essay, which again I refer to in my book, and I can reference for you if you'd like, called The Entropic Mind. And he does research with psychedelics, the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. And I'm not advocating this. I just want to point something out. And that is this. The diagram on the left is, again, a highly stylized depiction of the synapses in the brain under ordinary circumstances. The one on the right is the synapses in the brain under psilocybin. It all opens up. So what's on the left, on the right, is what he describes as the entropic mind. And this is very interesting to me. The other side of the entropic mind, of course, if the mind is too chaotic, that's not a good thing. You can really freak out, I guess, to use the most appropriate language. But the other thing is, if you control too much, then you have OCD. The completely controlled and tightened mind, which the one that wants to control all the synapses, is a form of OCD, which, by the way, is rampant. I mean, you can see it in yourself, of course. And so somehow we have to find a way to balance all this. And I think this is an educational challenge as well. So the challenge for educators, and I discuss this at some length in the book, is not to use psychedelics to open things up, but how do you use meditation, flow experience, and mindfulness awareness activities in the world to open those synapses, so that you can begin to perceive more than you customarily do. So you know that there are mycelium beneath your feet, that you begin to see the network connections, that you begin to understand that everything perceives. The Taoists got this. They have some wonderful expressions of the relationship between absence and presence, and how the 10,000 things continually unfold from absence. And many of the world's great wisdom traditions get this. So all of this culminates in the final section of the book. Well, there's going to be one more final thing I do before we quit quite soon, is this all leads to your participation in what I describe as your ecological neighborhood. Some years ago, I had a fellowship with Philanthropy Northwest in Seattle, and they asked me to write a little book, which you could download from my website, of which I'll say a bit more in a moment. It was called Pacific Northwest Changemakers, and I profiled 8 projects throughout, from Alaska to Montana to inner city Seattle and inner city Portland, that were multicultural, multi-generational, and sustainability oriented. I chose 8. I could have chosen hundreds of them, because like that analogy of throwing a rock, there are so many of these projects everywhere, and we don't often hear about them. If you think about the mainstream media, even if it's the so-called, liberal or progressive media, like The Guardian, or I wouldn't call the Post that, or the Times that, or MSNBC and CNN, they don't talk about this stuff. They just don't. It's so upsetting to me, because there are amazing people, and all this polarization stuff. Yes, you have to manage openness and vigilance. Yes, there are people who are very dangerous. Yes, there are people who want to steal elections, of course. But the fact of the matter is, there are more people who want to work together. And there are more people who are contributing to constructive change in their communities. But they don't make the news. The others do. Why? Because they have the loudest guns, and they shout the most, and they're the most corrupt, and they're the most newsworthy. But this is way more newsworthy in my view. And we need to do everything we can to promote these fantastic activities. The upper left is the Garden City Harvest in Missoula, Montana, that uses local farming and gardening as a way of dealing with elder care, of dealing with foster kids, of bringing communities together, of feeding the poor, and giving them organic gardening skills. The bottom left is the Cully neighborhood, the poorest neighborhood it's in Northeast Portland, a highly diverse neighborhood that's doing ecological restoration and ecological entrepreneurship, and has made incredible progress. On the right is the Lodgepole project, not Lodgepole. I'm temporarily blanking on the name, but it's at the Crow Nation in Montana, and they're doing incredible work with indigenous food banks, getting kids off to college as best they can, in a very, very poor place. These are everywhere. It's fantastic what's going on, and I just wanted to bring this to your attention, because really this is what this all leads to. It all leads to us working together in these ways to make differences in our community. And there are way more of us than you would ever know by following various media. And finally, I'm going to end on this. The second chapter in the book, what I'm going to talk about last year, I spent a lot of time looking at memory. And maybe that's because I'm in my early 70s now, but it's very interesting to look back on your life and draw from those experiences and think about how they inform what you do today and what you'll do in the future. And I strongly advocate this for teaching and learning, and for thinking about everything that we do. And I try to make a distinction between adaptive learning, which is improvisational excellence, how do we find a path through the changing flows and circumstances of our social and technological encounters on the one hand, and perennial learning, awareness of the wisdom of the ages in another. And I love Gary Snyder, the great poet's note, this present moment that lives on to become long ago, which is really how I think we need to think about multi-generational legacy and what it means to live on the planet at this point in time. Now I go into some of my own childhood experiences, because I hope you'll go into yours. And Harold and the Purple Crayon, one of the first books I read when I was a very young boy, is about improvisational excellence. Harold falls asleep and he's dreaming his way through the world, and he gets lost and he gets frightened at times, and then he draws his way out of danger. And then the most beautiful part of this for me, and I guess somewhere deep down in my own origins, it's where I came in, where place-based learning is so important to me. When he finally tries to figure out, where do I belong? How do I get home? He remembers that his bed was by a window where there was a half moon. So if he can draw the window and draw the half moon and draw the bed, he can find himself at home. So the lesson is that he needs his place, and he needs to be able to find and draw his place, to have the courage to explore widely. And that's a metaphor for, I think, our times and what I try to convey in the book. And also the other is the role of wonder in our lives. And the great Jewish theologian and philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel once wrote that indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root cause of sin. And think about that. It's really so true that we always need to reside, at least for some time during the day, in places of wonder. When I was a little boy, my parents took me to the Hayden Planetarium, and I picked up the Golden Guide to the Stars, and I loved that book. But it also terrified me, because on the one hand, it showed me what's out there. On the other hand, it showed me what's out there. And as a little boy, I began to grapple with notions of infinity, and that was challenging. So all of these things are part of the package. And there are also experiences from childhood that are quite disturbing. When I was a little boy, we moved from the city to a suburb on Long Island, and the fog man would come through. He'd spray DDT. And the first time or two that he was there, we were unsupervised, and we'd run out through the fog. And it was like, wow, there's a fog it's a cloud on the right here, and we can run through it. And then, of course, I'd get a headache or two. And it was a toxic experience, which actually wound up manifesting itself in my body, I think, later on in life. So when I did this, a very preliminary version of just this chapter of the book to a group of international students at NYU doing environmental education, every single student in the class could cite a childhood toxic experience that was important for them to remember. So that's why I focus on memory, because there are memories of moments of awakening, and moments, which will be my next book, by the way, a memoir of various moments of learning throughout my life, but also moments of toxicity in memory as well. And these are all part of the package. So there's an appendix in the book that lists all the different activities that I suggest that are useful for various learning situations, as well as for individuals who want to practice them. And we end with this beautiful tapestry that I saw in a hotel in Hobart, Tasmania, of people who were doing little patches of place, and why their home place in Tasmania was so important to them wherever they might be in the world. And I think that's a fitting message to end this project: the importance of home and the importance of place, even in a world that's constantly changing, and a reminder that you can learn a lot about a place by looking at how the place deals with newcomers. And I think that's another very important challenge for all of our communities, is how do we welcome people who have no choice but to move into our communities. Please do visit my website. It's just myname.com. Write to me. There's a few things you can download for free if you'd like. I'd love you to share this with me. It's lovely photos of the region, some of my son's artwork. And if you want to get in touch with me for any reason to talk about what I'm doing now, I'm happy to do so. I also do talks like this without any need for compensation if I'm doing them virtually. So if you want me to address your group in one way or another. And there's a list of some of the other things that I do based on other books, if you'd like to see it there. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you and taking time out of your day to be with me. I really appreciate it. And I thank the folks at Fielding for this great opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mitch. We're going to have some time now for conversation and questions and comments. And so Fred is going to help facilitate us through that.
Yeah, and what we would like you to do, since we have, looks like 50 very eager people, is to just post your questions in the chat. And that way we also have a record of them. Recognizing that, I mean, Mitch's talk has been so inspiring for so many of you, clearly, that we still then also have a record of which questions are not addressed, but we can address later. But as a way of opening that up, Mitch, I have a question for you. If it's okay, if I can abuse my privilege as a co-facilitator. And that is, for me, one of the great aspects of all of your books is the exercises that you offer for people as learning exercises. And one of the things that I'm interested in is how you, as an author, learn yourself from questions that are being asked. So one that how people may respond in ways that also allows for the improvisational excellence that you talk about. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about one exercise that I've used quite a lot, the senses of place mapping exercise. Yeah. And in particular, the reason I'm asking about it is one of the things that I found with it is how people, in doing it, recognize how much of their day they spend in what are for them non-places. It is places that they move through without any connection to at all, and how this opens up to awareness. But maybe you could say a little bit more about the exercise itself while we're waiting.
Yeah, I will. And before I do that, though, I want to thank everyone. I just briefly scanned the chat, and I want to thank folks. First of all, the people who put the resources down and posted the websites for some of them. Just great comments, and 4 Arrows. David Abrams, a very good friend of mine as well. And if you see him, please say hi for me, and I'd be thrilled and delighted and honored to look at your work. So please do send it to me, and I can give you the address for it. But the comments are so great and so helpful. Man, I'd love to talk to every single one of you. The sense of place was one of the first interactive activities I ever designed for my classes, because I just wanted to know more about who I was working with. And I wanted them to know more about each other. So now I don't teach that much now. I teach 1 course a year in Antioch, Seattle, but I always start it with a sense of place map. And what winds up happening is, I think, first of all, when you do any kind of project like that has an art orientation, you're going to find out things about yourself that you didn't even know. You explore deeply within, and you remember things that you might have forgotten, or things that you realize what's really important to you as you deliver it. And then other people reflect back to you what they think is important about your work, and your work changes. So the next person who does the map realizes they've been informed by the first person, and it becomes a chain of sorts, a sequence. And before you know it, the sense of place is a collective memory of every single person. So that's an improvisational process of sorts, where each person contributes their own memories and their own icons and special places, and then it becomes everyone's. And I think you're right. What happens with electronic media is, there was a book by a guy named Joel Meyerowitz many years ago called No Sense of Place. Yeah. Right? It was a great book.
He's a native of yours, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, he was at UNH. Yeah. So I think that it reestablishes the importance of the naturalness of places. And now, of course, it's so crucial that with so much of the world in urban centers and urban places, that we create testimonies to the various ways that nature manifests in the city as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mitch. And looks like a good follow-up to the question from Sheila Smith. Please say more about taking deliberate pauses and how that encourages an ecological identity and leads toward caring for our planet's ecological health.
Well, deliberate pauses they really come out of the mindfulness tradition. The mindfulness meditation tradition is all about the present moment and centering your attention and finding ways of getting focus in a world in which you're constantly distracted. So given my interests and what I write about and think about, though that mindful awareness can just as easily take place with the focus of some object in the natural world. There are all kinds of ways you can do this. You could focus on a particular sense. You can just close your eyes for 3 minutes and listen to all the sounds around you or all the smells around you. Really, so much of this you can invent on your own, and I suggest you do so. But it all does stem from that idea of being in the present moment. And how easy it is to shift away from the present moment and think about what you're going to do next, or think about what you just did. There's a great section in great book, How to Change Your Mind, in which he talks about how he's always one step ahead of himself, and that he's really good at anticipating what's going to happen next in his life or what's going to happen next in a conversation. And a lot of his success has been based on his ability to always be one step ahead. Yet in the process of being one step ahead, he's never really in the present moment. And he's really missing a lot. And I read that and say, wow, yeah, that's exactly it. That's what happens to me all the time as well. So how do you get back to not having to be one step ahead, but being in the present? That's what I mean by the deliberate pause. It's deliberate. You're saying, oh, that's enough. I'm going to take some time right now and look at the world in a different kind of way.
And it sounds like you might be inviting people to take a walk after this session.
That's absolutely.
Pause, right?
Yeah, or just a minute or two. It doesn't have to be, it could be 1 minute every 20.
Thanks, Mitch. So we have a question from Sharon Ryan also, which is, how can environmental leaders identify and build more co-powering social networks for optimal impact across these complex issues and diverse age agents you noted, such as health, social justice, climate, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, Sharon. And I actually address it in the PDF that you can find on the website called Pacific Northwest Changemakers, because that was written for funders ultimately. And what I recommended to people who are funding projects like these is that they create time and space for a new generation of leadership of these projects and organizations who are so busy that they rarely have the time to do the networking that they need. And what winds up happening is that you have a lot of people, majority of whom are women, many of whom come from communities of color, that are catapulted into really important organizational change processes and really need time to sit back and reflect on what that means. And also who are called upon to mentor younger people, even though they themselves are often under 40 or even under 30, and need some time to think about what that all means. So I think that, what happens in the philanthropy world is they're always looking, I know this is not what you're asking, but they're always looking at the next new project, or they're always looking at how they can evaluate projects. But in fact, what most organizations need is not that. They don't need better evaluation. They don't need new projects. They need the infrastructure that they can do their current projects well. And part of that infrastructure is having the time to do exactly the type of social networking that you're suggesting. So, there are a lot of ways to make it work and make it happen. And that's one of them. But my experience when I did this project in Seattle, when I was in Seattle, was that there are so many social change, social justice, environmental change organizations, and many of them are aware of each other's work. And they do everything they can to cooperate. They just don't have enough time to do it as well as they'd like.
Thanks, Mitch. I'll read a question from Four Arrows, who's also faculty in the School for Leadership Studies. Could you speak to the decolonizing education movement both on behalf of Indigenous sovereignty, but also in terms of rethinking fundamental assumptions about the world and our place in it from precepts shared by most of the diverse Indigenous peoples, such as seeing sentience in nature.
Well, there's so
and then
much.
there's a second part. It says the UN Biodiversity Report found that this worldview might be crucial for survival, proving a reduction in extinction rates in the few places still controlled by this Indigenous worldview.
Right. Well, that's a lot. 4 arrows. They're great questions. They're statements as well as questions. I'm not sure there's much I can say about this that you don't already know. But what I will suggest is that the best way to learn about the place where you live is to find out not only who lives there now, but who lived there before you. And you're sure to explore and discover things that you never previously knew. It's like when I was a university president, and I work with other university presidents, and I would speak to presidents of tribal colleges and talk about sustainability, they kind of laugh at me because their view was that this is something that they've always known. So my approach to this, and this is what my approach was when I visited the Center Pole Project. That's the project on the Crow Nation in Montana, the Center Pole Project. Is when I visited them for several days to report on their work, was just to learn, listen and learn and ask questions. And which is, it's really hard for me to keep my mouth shut, but that's what needed to happen. Is just to
Museum of Natural History, the museum indoor galleries and up.
But it's just to ask a whole bunch of questions. And I think that's the attitude, is direct relationship and good listening. And that's how you get access to some of those precepts and get access to some of that knowledge. So that's my first response to a complicated and challenging question, but a very necessary and crucial one.
Okay, here's a follow-up question from Jean Lee Weeks Parker, who is an educator, an alum of Fielding. And Jean Lee asks for references that you would recommend about global patterns of ecological changes in the K-12 classroom learning environment, particularly with regard to interconnection of team evaluators, accreditation agencies, but I guess looking for resources for K-12 education around global patterns of ecological change.
Yeah. Well, first, I think she mentioned that she read my book. Thank you for that.
Well, I think this is in addition to your book, Mitch.
Yeah. I can't tell you about K-12 resources. That's, I just don't know what they are. But I think there are fantastic general resources for anyone who wants to learn about global environmental change. A great place to start, where is it? I've got to turn around for a minute, which isn't as easy as it once was. Where is that book? Oh my goodness, give me a second. Okay, I found it. This is an incredible book. It's super expensive. You have to get it out of the library. And it's fairly old. It's about 15 or 20 years old. It's called Global Change and the Earth System. And it's filled with charts and diagrams. And it is the most comprehensive assessment of global environmental change that I've ever seen. And my suggestion is that, obviously, it's not a book that you're going to give to K-12, but it's a book, the information in here is what you can adapt. And so I think it's what you adapt for your own use and how you make those adaptations. There are probably great materials out there. Gaming is a terrific way to do it. And, with this fantastic new proliferation of gaming that's taking place, both real life, boards and virtual, there are all kinds of simulations that you could try out that are very helpful. But that's one example of something that's really great. Another book I'd like to point out, which I think is a fantastic template for teaching, is a book called Mannahatta, which is by, what's his name? Eric Sanderson. And what he does in this beautiful book, well, you can't really see it this way because I took the cover off, is he recreates Manhattan, going back to the Lenape people, and looks at all the different habitats on the island of Manhattan going back many, many, many years. And it's so visual and so interesting. And I think one of the best ways that you could teach about environmental change to a K through 12 group is have them do something similar in their own community and create the maps and write fiction and poetry and stories and do artistic work that takes them back, you know, to the original peoples who lived in that place. Oh, by the way, Jennifer Morgan, I just saw her comment. We center our programs inside the cosmic story, inspired by Maria Montessori. I once gave a talk to a Montessori group of educators for my book, Bring the Biosphere Home. And I was talking about the importance of teaching about scale and the challenges of infinity. And I remember one of the Montessori educators said to me, oh yes, Maria Montessori thought that children even at the age of 3 could understand infinity.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no. It's interesting because this is one of the things that's a good model of the very thing you're talking about, that you mentioned Jennifer Morgan, but there are other people posting responses to the questions that they're coming up with resources. So I invite people to save the chat, which you can do, and we can save it for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. Available now for free download. Isn't that cool? Thank you, David Blake Willis. That is great.
I have a question for you, Mitch. So Mitch's wife, Cindy Thomashow, is also does a lot of work in environmental leadership and environmental education, and started a program at Antioch on urban environmental leadership. And I'm really interested and struck by the comments that you made about the sort of the renewal and the deepening of environmental learning, and where you see some of the issues are and what the possibilities are. And of course your talk spoke to that, but I was wondering if you've learned some specific lessons through that program as well, because I know that it's really it's been engaging some issues that aren't typically a part of environmental leadership.
Right. Well, here I have two observations about that. First from my teaching, and then from a broader experience. The sense of place maps are incredible, but I've also gotten into these migration maps. And that is really something, because you really begin to see all the different places people come from and where they've been, and how ephemeral a place becomes for so many people who wind their way into these classes. So that's been very interesting. I will also say that when the cohorts in this program are diverse, I really enjoy the classes, and when they're not, I don't. I mean, one of the things about diversity, and I used to say this all the time when I was president of Unity, you can talk about all the politically correct reasons why you want to do this, but let's just really be clear about it. You're not getting a good education if your education is not with a diverse group of people. It's really as simple as that, because you're just seeing a very narrow view of the world. And that's why we do it. That's why it makes sense. Yes, there are political reasons as well, but it's just a straight on, you're not getting a good education unless you're going to a diverse institution. The other thing I've learned just by watching, because one of the things that Cindy has done, which is really great, is they're trying to get people from various organizations to attend classes in the program, so they could understand how they could do more in their own organizations. And there still are so many organizations that think, oh, if we hire a person of color, then we've done what we're supposed to do. And just don't have any clue or any sense of the really deeper questions that are being asked here about politics, about white supremacy, and ultimately about leadership. So I think that it's so crucial that if you really want to move towards being a more inclusive and more diverse institution in one way or another, you have to think very deeply and strategically about how you're going to do this and what your commitment's going to be over time. So for example, I always recommend to organizations, if you want to diversify your board, just don't bring on just 1 or 2 board members, bring on an entire cohort. That's the way you get things done. It's true in so many different walks of life. So I think we're beginning to see this now. I think we're beginning to see more organizations understand that they need to be strategic, they need to be comprehensive, but there are still many that feel, oh, well, we could just do some lip service and then we could check off that box. And that just doesn't work. It's facile and it's meaningless. And it puts tremendous pressure on the people that get hired, who suddenly, they are, it's not unlike, in a different kind of way, when a university hires a sustainability manager. So often, if there are any sustainability managers here, you understand this. And then they think, well, okay, that person will take care of it. Well, their portfolio, if you're a sustainability manager at a university, your portfolio is way bigger than what you could possibly do yourself. I mean, way, 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 way bigger. But what winds up happening, there's a diversity officer now, By the way, a really interesting, she signed up, but I don't think she's here today, is Yolanda Moses, who was for many years the president of City University of New York and is now the vice chancellor for diversity at University of California, Riverside, and completely and thoroughly understands the importance of officers of diversity working with folks in sustainability and environment. And I always to sustainability managers, work with your diversity office and work together so you can move. And this is a good answer also to the person who asked about social justice and environmental folks working together on university campuses. Those folks are natural allies and need to work together very closely. So just a few scattered thoughts from your very good question.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. And I see, Parag, it looks like you've been raising your hand. So you could go ahead and ask the question yourself. You don't need us as middle agents here to help you.
Well, thank you. I teach here at South Puget Sound in Olympia, and thank you for this amazing presentation. And we're looking forward to using this in our classes. In the last year, it's been, I came to your book after a whole year or two of meditation and trying to find answers in my practice, and having taught environmental politics and worked in Botswana for the last 20 years, it sort of connected things. So it's really inspiring. The question I have you is more provocative though. It's about politics, since I teach political science, and the deep question I have is the moment we are in, and polarization, and how our minds have been, are continuously being molded in ways. And as India goes through this current wave, I see the same pattern being replicated at a societal level. And I was speaking to a friend who said, I finally understand how people can follow, even if he compared it to being in a system where you had Nazis and you were following some fake narrative, and he sees a similar process happening. He's saying, I finally get it. Oh, people make sense of the world based on their own belief systems. So now majority of people believe that this crisis that's happening is not really because of a governance failure, and we're still fighting about our temples and mosques and reframing the narrative. So 2 years from now, we can bring this government back to power. So he's already beginning to see a re-articulation of a narrative, even as we are in it. So the question I have is that in doing my own practice, and what we learned in the last year was that we can come out and protest, and we did. And then it's basically been co-opted, and we're back to business as usual in some places. In some places, we have not even been acknowledged in our universities, in our colleges. And it's really with the breath. It's really with the understanding and the grounding. As you said, where do we go? Coming home is coming back to the breath. And in that awareness of the inhales and exhales, and this is the part I was going to get to your observation, was that it's really in letting me breathe, and that awareness and staying with it. And then when we let go, we really let go. So what new meaning I found with this, yesterday we had a 1-year anniversary, and the practice we did was that each moment really has to be that awareness. And as you were saying, in a day, we make space. So in our meditation practice, we make space. All our senses, our seeing, our eyes, our ears, we are just making impermanent sense of the world. So the question I have is, how do we address the anger, the hatred, the distrust from your narrative, right? What are those practices that will bring compassion? And to me, the connecting the individual practice is important. But how do I bring in my institutions of politics, which reduces us to voting, which we can't change? I work in a context of a constitution, a Supreme Court, a legislature, and we have to work. So I'm going to pause here. So I've just sort of given you so much. There's no answer here per se, but I just wanted to say that really connecting for me the inner world with the outer world is what you've given me as an environmental learner, is that I have a vocabulary in your book and I have my own practice, which Abigail is familiar with. We all are part of our contemplative practices. So I will invite you for our later gathering next year at the bioregion and share with you our contemplative practices, which you've also shared in the book, and show we can bring change. But we ought to bring it in our classes and our community colleges. I think that's where our problem is. Our institutions are stuck in the 20th century and our ideas are in the 21st. So I'll pause here and return to you to whatever's arising for you.
Well, there's a lot there, man. First of all, I'm going to be in Seattle next week, but we're going to be devoted to our daughter and her girls. But once travel starts happening again, I do get out to Seattle 1, 2, or 3 times a year, and I'll be happy to meet up with you some point when it's safe to do so, whenever that might be. A few things I can say. I think it's a very dangerous time we live in, and we are constantly have to be vigilant. That's why I discussed the relationship between openness and vigilance. I think that's the practice. How do you remain open when there are so many threats to everything that we care about and everything that we believe in? That is a practice for sure. I mean, you know better than I mean, there are all kinds of great masters like Pema Chodron and so many who talk about, how you can witness the suffering and be clear through it. But that takes extraordinary individuals, and it takes tremendous experience to do that, and to do that well. I think it's very, very, very hard. So one way to think about strategically the relationship between openness and vigilance is to say that when I find people who are willing to listen to what I have to say, and I share interest in what they have to say, then something can happen. We can go somewhere. We have something to communicate. But when I run into somebody who doesn't give a damn about what it is I have to say, will never hear it, I don't waste my time. I'm sorry. I don't show compassion for all beings that way. There are too many other people out there who really genuinely, people who have very different perspectives than I do, but who really genuinely want to learn and have a conversation. And I find that whatever I do is, when I have a conversation, I always ask people, why do you think that way? What is it that, well, here's an example. When I was president of Unity College, Unity College is not a precious environmental college. We have a lot of first-generation students who love to hunt. We had a board that half of the board members were right-wing, hate taxes, love guns, love the outdoors, and the other half were environmental progressives. And when I became president, every Friday, I would go visit a board member, in part to see whether they had any money. They didn't, but also to get a better understanding of what they cared about. So I'd ask them a whole bunch of questions. So by the time I established my credibility as a president, which wasn't hard because my predecessors weren't all that good, by the time I established my credibility and people trusted me, they would really begin to listen to what I had to say, because when I first entered the place, I was listening to them. So about a year into it, one of the board members said, well, do you really believe in this climate change nonsense? And I'd be able to sit down and actually have a conversation. Yes, I do, and here's why. And the person trusted me and believed me, but it took me a year or so of demonstrating my competence as a president of this college before the person would be willing to listen to me. So in other words, I was successful on that person's terms. That is, the college was doing well, and that I was a good listener, and that I was a good leader. And so they began to listen to what I had to say about other things, but that takes time. I mean, all these things take time. It's all about persistence as well. And we're a country that gets bored very easily, that gets distracted very easily. So I would say openness, vigilance, persistence, all of those things together matter. And I also think now is a time, there is so much great scholarship that's coming out right now about African-American history, white supremacy, dictatorships. There is so much good stuff to read. It is really amazing. There's been a renaissance of a certain type of scholarship that's addressing this question. I mean, I was just reading yesterday about Tyler Stovall's book, White Freedom, which looks incredible. I mean, there are so many great things that we can be reading right now. Understanding that we need to have about the world that we live in. So just a few things, we can go on all day about what it is you have to say. And a lot of the perspectives that you are providing are areas where you have way more experience than I do. So I'm just another person responding to what you have to say. Thanks,
Mitch, and thanks for the question, Parag. So a little bit earlier, there was a post by Melissa George, who's joining us from Rabat, Morocco, talking about hidden circles. And maybe, Melissa, you can say something about your comment there?
Hi, sorry I don't have my camera on. It's a different time zone for me, and I was eating dinner earlier and back from the gym. So usually I have my camera on though. Yeah, I was working at the American Embassy School in New Delhi a few years ago, and part of working with the grade 8 teachers and developing a really cool unit the second semester that looked at population studies and a wide range of topics from, women and marginalized groups, the ecology of the Yamuna River in Delhi, where they went and took water samples and investigated different issues and challenges that Delhi was experiencing. We had a camp right next to our school that borrowed electricity from us and had no running water. So we had ample opportunity in our community to take kids out and really work in the large city of Delhi was our classroom with kids. But the coolest project actually happened in our lobby of our middle school. Students interviewed the cleaning staff and the cooks at our school and did a really nice showcase with pictures and wrote up some nice poems and essays about their lives, which languages they spoke, where they came from, how they came to work at the school, how many years they'd worked there. And the whole purpose of this showcase, this exhibition, was to draw attention to the fact that there are people in our school community that are hidden to us, that we don't acknowledge or see or interact with for various reasons. So it was again, I was fortunate enough to see some of these great parts of the curriculum that were already established when I got there and see what they looked like. So there are some pretty wonderful things happening in some of the international schools overseas. That's just one example.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And there are some pretty amazing things happening in schools in North America too. There's a wonderful book, I'm looking for it. It's called The Newcomers by Helen Thorpe. And it's about a high school in the Denver metropolitan area that works with refugees and migrants. And it profiles one teacher who, during the course of a year, will have students coming and going based on, what their status is, and who largely don't speak English. He could have a dozen languages. And it's about the work that he does and how this high school accommodates these types of students. There's also all kinds of curriculum out there. If you just, do some research and look for curriculum about dealing with refugees or any of that, you can find some terrific resources, or look for organizations, educational organizations that are dealing with this challenge. They're there. They're all out there. And that's my other response to your question about the relationship between inner and outer. I'll go back to what I said before. Yes, the same dialogue is being re-articulated about the election being stolen and the recounts and all of this. Oh God, it's utter corruption on so many levels. These false narratives, the denials, but there's way less of that. It just gets more attention than there are the other really good things that are going on. And people who do want to make a difference, the first responders, the people who've been on the front lines in terms of the pandemic, the heroes, the countless heroes who do extraordinary work every single day. And I think that needs to be the center of our attention. That needs to be the center of our inspiration. Be aware and vigilant about these jerks who want to steal things, and make sure that they don't have an opportunity to do that. But don't pay them too much attention either, because that's what they want. What a relief it's been to not have Donald Trump in my mind every day. What a relief that is. Let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate the fact that whatever you think of the current administration, we have adults in the room who care about government, who care about leadership. Wow, we were so close to so many awful things happening. And that's not to say they won't happen. The threats are always there. Their threats are always there. If I go back through my 70 years and think about things that freaked me out, it all started with when I was 7 years old and I went to school. And the teacher said, we're going to do an air raid drill right now. So put your heads down on your desk. Then I had seen a picture of an atomic bomb and I thought, what, is she kidding me? Does she think this is going to help? Huh? Is this how dumb these people are? At 7 years old, I could think that kind of stuff. You go through the threats. So when I was a little boy learning about the Holocaust, learning about the civil rights movement, all of these things, they go on and on and on. They're threads of human history. As I write about in the book, you can't necessarily, tribalism is built into our evolutionary heritage. You have to understand that and mitigate it and teach about it so you can transcend it. But it's not going to go away through kumbaya. We have to be realistic about all of these things. Look, the path of good and evil lies through the center of every human heart. So it's really important to have that self-awareness, as has been suggested. Anyway, I'm kind of going on now. But thanks for all the suggestions and all the comments.
So Mitch, going on is not a bad thing at all. I enjoy your going on, as do many of the people judging from the comments. So I'm wondering now, because your talk is so inspirational, clearly for so many, and with other talks that you've given, if other people have gotten back to you with things that they were inspired to do that you perhaps hadn't thought about yourself, that you might like to share with us right now.
Well, you mean today?
Or today in the last year. I don't mean specifically right with this group right now, but maybe you gave a talk last week and someone said, that inspired me to understand my world differently, or to teach differently, or to invite others into my world differently. So something where someone's gotten back to you and said, this is.
That happens in so many different ways, in so many different contexts. Something recent happened, and a student, she was signed up for this, but I didn't see her name in the participants list. A student contacted me from George Brown University in Toronto because she was trying to launch various sustainability initiatives. Didn't know about this book, but knew my previous book, The 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus. And she got in touch with me through LinkedIn. And I wrote back to her and I said I'd be happy to talk with her. And so we got on the phone, we set up a Zoom call. and she brought her advisor. She's an adult student, and we had an amazing conversation. I was so blown away by her eloquence, her understanding of networks, her understanding of some of the things that she could do already. I mean, I was so inspired by her intention, her motivation, and her perseverance. So that is the heart of it all. It's not usually substantive. It's usually about will and intent and energy. And when I see people who want to make a difference in the world, I'm just, that's how I'm inspired. And look, yes, a lot of it happens through reading. I mean, I've gotten to the point where just about every book I read, with some exceptions, I'm inspired by. There's so many great minds thinking so many great thoughts. I mean, the books just pile up, you know, they just pile up one after the other because there are so many amazing people with interesting things to say out there. I can't get enough of it.
That's great. I mean, it's a kind of reciprocal learning that you're talking about. That actually feeds in. Rose has this really nice question, which could open up into a long dialogue after this. Rose asks, what's the role of knowledge production in perceptual reciprocity of eco-consciousness? Thank you, Rose.
I'd have to ask Rose back. I'm not sure what you mean.
And Rose, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, I may a little bit jumbled here, but just curious around production of knowledge and how do we know what we know from the well, one of the concepts I'm still grasping is the perceptual reciprocity, and how do we understand that in the context of globalization, and how do we cultivate that level of awareness around how do we understand the world that we learned or conditioned through different lenses. I'm not sure where this take, but just wondering the role of knowledge generation. How do we, where shall we go from here?
Okay. Well, thank you, Rose. It's a really big question, and it's a really good question. I wanted to hear a little bit more about it, because what winds up happening sometimes is we use all these words, and I wanted to make sure I understood what you meant by all of those things. Someone here has a comment. Yes, we start from where one is with the connection, at least in mind. It's all connected, but one has to start where one is. I think that's part of the challenge of being an educator and being a citizen, is to just constantly be critical and be open. Yes, we are all conditioned in many respects, but the conditioning is not total. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this conversation. We're able to transcend it. And we always have to ask the question, what's most important about the situation? What's the most important thing for me to learn right now? And that's where a good teacher serves as a guide. I mean, a really good teacher, yes, does teach across the curriculum, does teach to multiple ways of knowing, tries to find out the essence of a student and how to bring that voice out. I think the very best teachers try to find the open areas in a student and the skill set that a student has. So often in schooling, students have skills that never even come to the foreground because schooling may be focusing on a very particular set of skills. I found, for example, even getting back to Fred's original question, when we did the sense of place maps, one of the things that happened is that some students are better writers than others. And undergraduate and graduate education privileges better writers, just the way it is. So, and that's important too. I'm not saying it's not, but what winds up happening when you use artistic orientations in projects, there are people who are able to get access to connections and relationships that wouldn't get access to them necessarily through the written word. So I think that's part of this whole question of knowledge production and conditioning, and some of the ways that you detach yourself from the layers of what's privileged, if you will, is to use multiple ways of knowing in a variety of situations.
Thanks for speaking to that, Mitch. And I think we're close to moving towards the end of our time together. There was another question in the chat from Lisa about do you have any suggestions for interactive learning activities or what places to go to get some ideas? So it's kind of more of a resource-oriented question as I read it.
Right. Well, I hope it's not too presumptuous or egotistical to say you should definitely check out my books, because all of the books, but especially the current one, To Know the World, and then Bringing the Biosphere Home and Ecological Identity, are filled with activities of just absolutely. There's a chapter in Bringing the Biosphere Home called Perceptual Ecology. So I guess perceptual ecology precedes perceptual reciprocity. And it's filled with all kinds of ideas for teaching and learning that you can do in a group or you can do as an individual. That's one way to start. But even if you did something like, if you Googled something like participatory learning, you're going to find all kinds of organizations and people who do that kind of work. Somebody the other day got in touch with me who is part of a network of folks who think about participatory learning all the time. And if you send me an email, which you can find on my website, I can send you her contact information. She has groups of people who get together and they're really interested in participatory learning. She lives somewhere in Oregon. I'm temporarily forgetting her name, but yeah, but I can connect you with her that way. And as you're about to close, I'll remind people, please do contact me. I get right back to folks with, on email, usually not more than 24 hours and sometimes sooner. But, if you want to contact me, I'm happy to chat with you in any way you'd like. So please do write.
Thank you so much, Mitch. And I think we probably will close together now. It's just been an incredibly rich 2 hours, both your talk and then also the dialogue that evoked. And something that is absolutely standing out for me is the polarity of vigilance and openness. And I mean, that itself is a cone, and it's a practice that that is it's so relevant right now in our fielding community, as well as, of course, beyond that. So yeah, just appreciate you sharing that with us. And I also know from my own experience in your classes that the book Ecological Identity it's just practice after practice as well. So and as I was saying at the beginning of our time together, that class is what I think awakened me to the importance of integrating our inner awareness and inner change with outer systems and culture change. So it's really shaped the path of the work that I do. So I just, profound appreciation to you for that. Thank you so much for being with us during this time. Just so everyone knows, we will be sharing the recording, so that will be available. We've also got the resources that are in the chat, and as Fred mentioned, you can save the chat. And then the Sustainability Advisory Council hopes to and intends to hold additional events in the future, and we might be in touch with you to get your suggestions and requests. This event was actually inspired by a suggestion that Linda Urban made coming across your work, Mitch. And so just by bringing forward the idea is what led to this possibility. And Mitch, I know that we're also hoping to continue to engage with you in the future as well. So thank you again so much for everything you brought to us. Thank you everybody for joining us. And thank you, President Rogers, for the FieldNotes series, and just looking forward to encountering all of us in our practice of vigilance and openness as we go forward in the work that we do. Thank you.
And Abigail, I just want to say that working with you and Fred and then Pablo and Brian as well, and speaking with Katrina has been an absolute delight for me. Your eloquence, Abigail, and your ability to synthesize information and move to the essence of things is really impressive, and it's just really great to work with you. Thanks for including me, and everyone at Fielding has been so impressive. I mean, it speaks highly of the organization. Just one logistical question. I'd love to get access to the chat. I mean, how do I do that?
We can send it to you, Mitch.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can also save it, but we can send you the saved version that we have.
Okay, that would be terrific. So that's it. I mean, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming again, and it's such a pleasure to work with all of you.